Right, hello, Mr. Page. Thank
Oh,
you for coming
hello.
in today. Thank you for coming in. You're here for the job interview. Yes,
Uh,
yes.
yes,
You've come for the interview.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity to apply. Thank you for letting me have a job interview,
Yes.
sir.
Well, I've got some basic questions here. Nothing too extraordinary, but hopefully this will give you a sense of the job that we're requiring of you. So how are you with heights?
Uh, heights are great. I love heights. I'm high right now. I mean, I'm not high. I'm just up high.
I
Uh,
see.
I'm
So
on the
about,
first floor.
6 or 7 feet off the ground, you'd be okay with that?
Oh, of course. Yeah,
Of
anything for a
course.
job. Yeah,
Okay. What about
absolutely.
high voltage electricity? How are you with that?
High voltage electricity.
Is that something that you favor having upon
Oh,
your
absolutely.
person, near your person? You're okay with that?
Sometimes I stick a fork in the toaster just, to get my morning started, so
Oh,
I'm great with
that's excellent.
electricity.
Oh, then you'll fit right in here. Yes. Okay. And finally, I need to just check how are you with your hands? Your hands. How are you with your hands?
Well, they never leave my arms. Stay attached.
Okay. Well, let's see. Well, we'll get back to you about the job working
Thanks very much.
on in the Century 21 film studios as a puppeteer, but
Oh,
we'll
so
see.
exciting.
We'll see whether you're up for that job or not. I'll have a word and see whether you're up for that job.
Thank you.
I
Thank you
was
so
giving you
much.
a it was a job interview. It was a comedy improvisation, Ben. That's what
Wow.
I was doing just then.
I'm
It's a
just gonna go
comedy
get my
improvisation to see whether you would cut the mustard as a Supermarionation
that was
puppeteer.
brilliant, brilliant improvisation. I Why don't you play the intro and I'm gonna go get my Murray Protter. I'll be right back.
Oh, very good. Welcome back to the Security Hazard Show, a podcast so laid back, Colonel White would insist that we're a spectrum base and not a rest center.
That's true. I'm here with your host, a man who can twizzle his own arms and legs, but only if you ask very, very nicely. It's Jack Knoll. Hello,
Ah, thank you,
Jack.
thank you, thank you. Hello, hello. And well, what can I say about this man? If he was a Thunderbirds pod vehicle, he would be the Domo because he's resilient, he's powerful, and he has 3 strong arms with sticky stuff at the end of them. Not sure what that's all about.
this, this is getting very strange. We've
Hmm.
already brought the Murray Protter into it, and it's all
Yeah.
downhill from here.
Niche.
If you
We
if
like it
you
niche.
uh, if you don't know what a Murray Protter is, we're gonna reveal all on this podcast. I
Hopefully,
suspect.
yeah, it's something we should get into, definitely.
Yeah. What's the
Um,
topic today, Jack? What are we talking
Topic
about?
of today's show, I thought let's do something special where we basically are going to go through all the different types of Supermarionation puppet, and we're going to
Wow.
discuss them because over the course of the sort of roughly 10 years or so that Gerry Anderson and Sylvia Anderson and the whole team were making puppet productions at AP Films and Century 21, they used puppets, but those puppets evolved over the course of that time. And from show to show to show, there were different styles and different advances in technology that the things that made the marionettes super, hence Supermarionation. So we're going to talk about some of those changes, what we like, what we dislike, what was maybe a weird step for them to take, what we might consider to be the ultimate form of a Supermarionation puppet, if you were going to consider it that way. So we're
Hmm.
going to go through them, start from the very beginning. We're actually going to start from before Supermarionation was even, I think, when it was but a twinkle in Gerry Anderson's eye, the term Supermarionation, before
Is
it had
that how
even
that
been
worked? There was
coined.
a twinkle in his eye, and that would one day become Super Marionation?
I'm not familiar with how these things work, but I'm sure that it must have been something like that. Yes. So yeah, we're just going to go through the whole thing. This is going to be a very relaxed, fit episode. We're just going to go through it, one by one as we see fit. It's worth prefacing this straight away by saying, if you are after historical accuracy, like really detailed, like fine detail about how these puppets were put together and how they were made, this is not going to be the podcast for you. This is going to be a lot of opinions. It's going to be a bit of guesswork, probably. We tried to do our research, but as always, you should go and source information from different places. And one of the things that I would recommend, actually, I happen to have it on my desk with me, is the book Filmed in Supermarionation by Stephen LeRiviere. Amazing book, tells you all about the history of Supermarionation, all the insights gathered from the people who were there making it at the time, looking at production paperwork, that sort of thing. So if you want a detailed, very vivid account of what was happening at the puppet studios at the time, this is the book for you.
Absolutely. And if you only have an earlier edition, the newest edition has a lot more information added.
The new edition is I think like the third edition, and I definitely consider it to be a. I mean, the original editions were amazing as well, but the amount of paperwork that became available for this book, extraordinary. Things like the meeting minutes from the production of Torchy the Battery Boy and stuff like that. If that's the kind of detail you like, which I certainly do, then this is definitely worth picking up. But we're going to try our own attempt at recording the history of Supermarionation, and I actually have some. We're going old-fashioned with this. I've got paper. I've got paper in my hand. This is a picture of Twizzle, because I wanted to have some kind of, for our video viewers, people who are watching us live on YouTube, I wanted to have reference images, but I wanted to do it in a slightly old-fashioned way. So rather than bringing up nice, crisp, clear, high-definition images on the screen, I thought I would just print out pictures of all the individual puppets from each series, so that we can compare and contrast them as we go. So
I'm fascinated that because puppetry is a physical medium, you've actually created a physical object to interact with there.
You could say that. You could also say that I'm wasting trees by printing all this stuff out, but
I don't know that it's a waste. This seems like the best possible use for a dead tree to me, is to put a picture of Torchy the Battery Boy on it.
Yeah, exactly. So, right, where to begin with this? I suppose the first.
You want to go all the way back to the very beginning.
I want to go back to Twizzle. The reason being that the desire, the way Gerry Anderson describes it in interviews and things like that, the desire was always there to take television puppetry and make it better. And to me, at least, that's what lies at the core of Supermarionation. What makes the marionette super is not necessarily any one specific technological advancement or creative decision. It's that general driving force towards, well, let's make these puppets the best they can be, the most realistic they can be. That is what I would define as, as the ethos of the whole thing, if you want to use such grand terms. And that is there, even though the term Supermarionation had not been invented yet, that desire is there from the very beginning of Twizzle.
Sure.
And it's hard to know that much about Twizzle. Obviously, we only have the one. Well, I say one surviving episode. We have now one surviving episode and 11 seconds of another random episode, which you can find on YouTube. Go look for that. It's. I won't go into that full story here, but there is in the year 2025, new Twizzle footage has turned up on
Unreal. It's very surreal.
crazy. But yeah, so it's difficult to make a firm judgment about Twizzle and puppetry, and particularly as we only have the first episode. I would love to see over the course of those 52 installments how the craft of puppetry kind of evolved from that point. How would you, based on that first episode, Ben, how would you rate the standard of puppetry and the way that Gerry Anderson himself chooses to direct the production? How do you think it fares overall?
I think it fares better than its reputation. I think people come to it sort of with this attitude of hindsight and of having seen what came later, and there's sort of a comparison that's very unfavorable. It definitely doesn't have the dynamics of a Supermarionation production. But the puppets themselves are not as crude as perhaps you might imagine. They do some sophisticated stuff.
Well, this is what I wanted to point out in regards to Twizzle, because there's contradiction that goes on just when talking about the Twizzle puppet itself.
Sure.
Gerry in interviews would always say, "Oh, the Twizzle puppets were really crude because the mouth was painted on and didn't move." That is not true. You can literally see on Twizzle's face, you can see a cutout of where the mouth clearly does move. And clearly does. You could see it in the first episode. It's not very high definition, obviously. The copy of the episode that survives is not very crystal clear.
No,
but you could tell the mouth is moving. Now, whether the mouth moved on every puppet,
there are definitely some where it doesn't.
I don't know.
And also, this is not the first puppet production that Gerry Anderson was involved with. He actually worked on a commercial, which we should bring up because, believe it or not, this past week was I think the 76th anniversary of the creation of the character of Noddy. British television legend Noddy.
Lovely Noddy.
And Noddy Noddy.
Yeah.
Was the star of,
to you as an American would just look out and go, what is this?
It's very confusing.
I'm curious, Ben, as someone who didn't, because I grew up with I think there was a Noddy TV show on when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And that was all charming and delightful and lovely.
Probably some Anderson alumni involved with that TV show too.
Possibly.
But not the one that not the one that you would have watched, but in the 70s, definitely there was a Noddy TV show that had some Anderson alumni in the puppeteering ranks, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. I don't even know how to describe Noddy. I mean, it's along similar lines to something like Twizzle or Torchy, where it's toys in Toyland come to life, having a lovely day, that sort of thing.
The aesthetic of it, the word for the aesthetic of it is twee. And twee isn't really a part of American culture, I don't think. It's a specifically UK thing, a British thing.
Yeah.
So it hasn't exactly come across the pond.
Yeah.
So it's a bit unusual, and there's nothing to really compare it to.
Right.
At least not that I could think of off the top of my head. We had things like Howdy Doody, who was a singing cowboy puppet.
Yeah.
But closer to Twizzle and Torchy or things like Kukla, Fran, and Ollie, which was a puppet show that's sort of like, but it was like a host talking to puppets, sort of Mr. Rogers, what Mr. Rogers would eventually do.
Right.
Different.
Yeah. It's interesting you're talking about tweeness being an inherently British thing, because I would argue that the tweeness is actually one of the things that certainly Gerry Anderson tries to extinguish completely over the course of Supermarionation. The tweeness is gone pretty quickly. Like that's the one thing he was trying to avoid. Which is interesting to take something as sort of child friendly as a puppet and go, right, well, we want to make this as grown up and sophisticated, and I'm not going to say clinical, but like, because there is warmth there, but it's a different kind of warmth that it's really difficult to define exactly what the charm is in the Supermarionation puppets, but it's there.
It's sort
at
of
least for the
it's
most
like
part.
the charm of a toy train. Do you know what I
Okay.
mean? It has that
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of like it's a really sophisticated, charming, like it wants to please in some way, where it's
Yeah.
like there's been a lot of like effort put in to make it, even though what exactly they're trying to make is, realistic or sort of Hollywood, sort of what they were going for, I think.
Yeah,
Sort of,
sort of glossy and glamorous, which is
yeah, very
definitely at
glitzy.
odds with that tweeness for sure.
Yes.
I have to say thank you to Simpsons Clips 24 in the live chat for reminding me. So the show was called Noddy's Toyland Adventures, made by Cosgrove Hall. Yes, that was
Thank you very
almost
much.
certainly the one that I remember watching as a kid. So thank you very much for stirring my memory of that. I'm going to probably go and look at YouTube clips and things like that after we finish broadcasting today. So thank you. But yeah, so that's Twizzle, a puppet that maybe deserves a bit more credit, because I think they are made with those puppets are made with a certain amount of artistry, but obviously done on a lower budget. It's fair to say the budget
Done,
on
I think,
Twizzle
on a
was,
stage, with a stage performance in mind,
yes,
because
and
the
that's the
eyes are
interesting
big and
thing.
you're sort of meant to see them from far away.
Yeah, well, that's very much the way Gerry directs it as well. When you watch that first episode, it is very much like, okay, put the camera on one end of the set and all the puppets over on the other end, and it's not very dynamic. There's not a lot
No.
of cutting to close-ups and things like that, which the editing became such an integral part of making those Supermarionation stories kind of emote and come across well. So yeah, definitely that was a big part of it. But anyway, we kind of have to unfortunately gloss over Twizzle quite quickly just because we have so little to say. So next up, Torchy.
Hi.
Now, obviously, that is the immediate reaction that everyone has is, oh my goodness, isn't Torchy scary? Isn't Torchy just the nightmare demon that we all love to hate? I would argue there is some appeal there.
Okay.
First of all, from a puppetry point of view, there have been advancements made.
Yeah.
It's difficult to kind of, again, with Twizzle, we know so little that it's
Yes.
difficult to be sure of the facts, but at least in interviews, Gerry Anderson would say that the Twizzle puppets were made of paper mache, whereas for Torchy, they started using a sort of plastic wood solution that just made the heads look more solid and enabled them to get a kind of smoother, a better looking finish, I suppose, on the whole thing.
The finish
Which
is definitely the most marked improvement there.
it is definitely an improvement.
Some
Whether
real hair as well.
yes, real
A
hair. I
real
was going to
big,
say
not
Twizzle
just a
seems to have
sculpted
sort of
head.
sculpted on hair, whereas Torchy actually has, I don't know, it looks like they stuck a mop on his head, to be honest. But still, they did something.
Progress.
There are textures become important.
Yeah.
And that's the same in Torchy as well with the sets. The sets sort of
Mhm.
make a move towards being three-dimensional and everything. So yeah, there is a sense of texture there that isn't in Twizzle.
Yeah.
That's sort of when I look at that first episode of Twizzle and compare it to the first episode of Torchy, that's the biggest difference that screams out at me.
Yeah.
But the scariness of the Torchy puppet is valid. It is not a face that many of us will love.
Yeah, there's something sort of sinister about his eyebrows.
Is it the
But that's
eyebrow?
mostly
Yeah.
they have that sort of like Mr. Spock kind of downward slope.
Yes. Yeah, Mr. Spock, actually, that's a really good shout. I hadn't thought of that. The interesting thing about Torchy, one of the things that maybe adds to its creepiness, but it's an innovation that people don't really talk about very much, is the fact that they had 2 sizes of Torchy puppet. They had the smaller one for when he's interacting with characters like Mr. Bumbledrop, like in the real world in inverted commas. When he's in the real world, it's a small child-sized puppet, and then when he goes to Topsy Turvy Land, when he goes off in his rocket and he's interacting with the other toys, it's a puppet more like that, where the proportions are slightly more sort of adult sized, I suppose. Like they try and make him look taller and he fits in. Interesting that they were at that time even thinking about scale and things like that, because it's not something I would have immediately figured. But yeah.
No, it's not. It's not. It's a small detail. It's sort of weird to think about that when you're sort of making something that's basically set in Candyland. I mean, it's very it almost doubles down on the tweeness.
In a way. I mean, it has to, because the scripts are so
it's even sillier as a concept.
It's so silly. Roberta Lee very much leans into the tweeness and plays it for all it's worth. I'm trying to think. Obviously, we see some weird and wonderful characters in Torchy. Things like the Hungry Money Box, which we talked about on our Unseen Pilot episode, which you can go and watch on Patreon right now, by the way. Gonna get a quick plug for that in. But yeah, I think because you have such fantastical characters like the Hungry Money Box and the Polycom bird and things like that
are a bit more abstract.
The abstract is the word for it. Yes, their hands are kind of tied. It's like, well, why go to the effort of trying to make these puppets look realistic or anything like a normal human being when they do have to interact with some pretty fantastical characters?
There's a pretty widespread mindset in puppetry in general that you shouldn't try to pretend that puppets are something that they're not, that they can do things that they can't do. You should lean into what they do well. And what a lot of puppeteers think they do well is abstract things that human beings can't do, or things that you could animate, but it would take a long time, or sort of leaning into the kind of uncanniness of puppets, that like that sort of eerie, creepy feeling is why puppetry is so popular in horror films.
Exactly.
Because it can create that spooky feeling really quickly and easily. But the team are not swimming with that current.
Absolutely not.
Battery.
But that's the interesting thing, actually.
Against it.
Yeah, but that's the interesting thing, is that the one thing you can say about Twizzle and Torchy is they had to be made with puppets, really. At least that's the medium that those types of stories fit with really well.
Yeah. How else could you have done it at the time? What other...
At that time, I mean, I can only think of, like, a 2D animation kind of cartoon type situation.
What would that have even been like, a Torchy cartoon? The mind boggles.
Oh, I dread to think, because then you get into the cartoony thing where you can play with proportions and have characters stretch, and Twizzle actually as a cartoon would work really well, because you could play up the stretchy arms and things like that even more so. In a way, puppetry kind of limits it in that regard. So, but certainly compared to a live action production. But it's interesting then when you get into Supermarionation proper, and AP Films branching out on their own away from Roberta Lee, because obviously Gerry, the story goes, Gerry always had the desire to make live action films, and the reason why he was trying to make the Supermarionation shows better and better is because he wanted someone to notice him as a potential live action producer. And the nature of the stories that therefore come along in Supermarionation productions, you go, well, that could be, like, I could conceive of Four Feather Falls or Supercar, or in later on Thunderbirds and Captain Scarlet being live action productions. They do take place in a version of the real world, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Torchy and Twizzle are just completely, as you say, abstract. I think that's a very good word for it.
Yeah.
So then we go from Torchy to Tex Tucker, or Feather Falls, which personal favorite of mine. Just, you know, if you want any example, and this is why I recommend, if you've never seen Four Feather Falls, for goodness sake, if you have any interest in the puppets, the Supermarionation, Gerry Anderson's work in general, go and look at Four Feather Falls, because the amount of development, the amount of track that gets laid for what comes later in Four Feather Falls is astounding. It really is incredible to watch that show develop and evolve over time. It is such an important piece of the Supermarionation puzzle, but people dismiss it because it's not science fiction and because they hadn't come up with the name Supermarionation yet. But Four Feather Falls is Supermarionation in all but name. Really, it's all the things that you would expect to see are there. I mean, where to begin? Those puppets are extraordinary. Obviously, we have to talk about the invention of the automatic electronic lip sync.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the automatic lip sync.
Prior to that, the Torchy and the Twizzle puppets, the lip sync was operated by hand. The operator from above would, I think, pull on a particular wire that would make the mouth open and close, and a spring would slap it shut. And they were basically trying to do the lip sync in real time to the pre-recorded dialogue. And, well, they got pretty good at it, I would say, over the course of Torchy. Like, it syncs up pretty well. I'm sure Gerry Anderson's own experience as a dubbing editor probably really helped in that regard, getting all the soundtrack to sync up with the puppets and things like that. But the idea is, when you get to the Four Feather Falls puppets, that the lip sync is happening electronically, with electrical wire running all the way from the control box in the studio, going right overhead and then down into the puppet, operating an electromagnet, a solenoid, to activate the movement of the lip, and then a spring to kind of slam it shut again. And I mean, what an incredible advancement for 1959, I think, was when they were really sort of starting to experiment with that sort of thing. There's a couple of Torchy puppets that actually do have that fitted, the Naughty Twins, which I'm sure will be an episode that we take a look at some point. But yeah,
also,
automatic lip sync
in the comments have called you and me, Jack, because we look so much alike.
Yeah, I can see that. I see you people, and I'm with you. I'm with you on that. Oh yes. But yeah, automatic lip sync, Ben. How well do you think it's implemented from the start? Does it have some teething troubles, maybe, or does it work pretty well?
There are some teething troubles. I think teething troubles probably throughout most of the history of the method. There's certain people who were there who have left stories for us about how they sometimes had to manually send the signals because the automatic part wasn't really working.
Yeah.
I think as a style, it works really well. I think it's a great way to give the puppets a bit of realism without maybe too much realism. The mouths, it would have been impossible to make mouths that could form words. The flexible lips and all of that animatronic business was
coming back to Roberta Lee. She did attempt to do that with things like Paul Star. If you've not seen Paul Star, my goodness me, that's a whole podcast we need to do right there. Actually, is taking a look at Paul Star. But yeah, where she does try to do the rubber mouths that open fully and try to form expressions. No, don't like it. Don't like that. Yeah, no, I think just the movement of that lip is enough. And the thing that Gerry at least says he was always trying to get away from with the manual lip sync being operated by a wire was the jerky head movement that would have to
Right.
go along as they were yanking the mouth open and close. So the idea was the electronic element was to eliminate that bobbing head thing, which is funny because when you go to Joe Public, anyone in the street, and you ask them to impersonate a Thunderbirds puppet, the first thing they do is the jerky head.
Right.
Because it has to, but the head move, it's a different kind of head movement, isn't it? It's where they have to almost simulate. They have to do a little bit of work to simulate the head movement that comes naturally from when we open our mouths. So in a way, it's like they had to sort of compensate for something that wasn't there, because it would look very odd if the puppet's head stayed totally still while the lip just moved. That would have a kind of creepiness of its own. So it's interesting, just the things they had to compensate for and, try and make adjustments to, and things like that. It's interesting.
The interesting thing about Four Feather Falls to me is the kind of liminal in-betweenness that it has between the like really abstract stuff and the more realistic stuff, where there's characters who, even some of the human characters, who have a very abstract kind of aesthetic.
Oh yes, I mean, but the thing is,
and
Tex Tucker is actually quite a normal looking puppet, really, like quite a normal looking character. Like
as Supermarionation puppets go,
the head is large, but they've tried quite hard to make him look like a real person. Whereas you get characters like Grandpa Twink is probably the first one that comes to mind.
Yeah,
where it's like he's got that enormous head, that chin that juts out for miles. There are some extraordinary caricatures in there.
Yes, and also, I mean, talking animals,
yes, of course.
So there's that too, where it's kind of like the realism is thrown to the wind. So it's an interesting balance where they sort of hit it right in between those two things.
Yeah,
which is really interesting.
Well, and it's worth stating, the story goes that the Four Feather Falls characters were illustrated by, originally designed by an ex-Disney animator. That's the story. We don't know the identity of said Disney animator. That has been lost to time, but it's something that people talk about a lot. And I mean, you can see that these puppets started out life as illustrations, because they have some of those over-exaggerated features that then, when that process was done away with and they started designing the puppets in-house just by sculpting, basically, I think that's, and by looking at reference photographs, you can tell that those more exaggerated features start to go away. Definitely when you start to notice that departure. So go from Four Feather Falls into Supercar. Now, I would argue that Mike Mercury is a more exaggerated caricature of a puppet than Tex Tucker.
I think that's a pretty fair assessment on your part. I think that's true.
To which I have to wonder why they made that choice. I think they were keen to exaggerate Mike's heroic features by giving him the strong brow and the big nose and everything that people talk about. But it's just interesting that that's then the direction that they went in.
Now, what materials would they have been using around this time? Have they moved on from the plastic wood and stuff?
So at that point they were using fiberglass.
Gotcha.
So making a mold and then lining it with fiberglass. I don't know the full process. I would love to one day try and make a Supermarionation puppet.
Oh wow!
Just to see how awful of a process that truly is, because I imagine it's frustrating, and I imagine it probably just took a lot of work to get all those features sculpted into the faces and things like that.
Get it just right.
Must be so difficult. And the thing that always sticks out to me is the millimeters of, because you're dealing with a smaller face than a human. Any slight change in appearance is immediately noticeable. And the interesting thing about Supercar is, because it was made in 2 separate production blocks, you have the first season of 26 episodes and then the second season of 13. The puppets were revamped. They sort of redesigned the puppets a little bit, just to, I would say, refine some of the features, make them a little less extreme in their caricatured nature. Particularly Jimmy Gibson. I think his face in the second season is much less unsettling than it is in the first. Yeah.
Oh, Jimmy.
But it's interesting because actually, when you look at those faces, when you really try and define exactly what it is that's different between those 2 batches of puppets, the detail is in millimeters of difference. It's things like eyebrows being trimmed just ever so slightly differently. And it's something, when we talk about the Thunderbirds puppets later, that will become very apparent.
Yeah.
But it's in those tiny little details. So you think, wow, it must have been so difficult from a continuity point of view to like make sure that not a hair was out of place on a character's head, because otherwise it's magnified so much on screen. And there's definitely an awareness of that when they're producing it. But
one of the things that struck me the first time I saw some of these puppets in person was how small they actually are. And you kind of know in your head, you hear about how big they are and you read how big it is, and you look at your ruler, your tape measure, and you go, that's about that big. Yep. And
it just has a tape measure ready to go off camera, by the way. That was very impressive. Well done.
Been waiting for this moment for the whole podcast.
Yeah.
No, you have an idea, in your mind, like how big they are, perhaps. But then when you see them in person, it's a totally different. You're like, wow, they are smaller. They feel smaller than they seem when you're watching the TV show, because you're in the world, and they shoot it at the right, at eye level to what the puppets would be. So you think of them as being real. And when you think of them as like real characters, then you're like, you default to giving them more realistic proportions than perhaps they have. So there's an element of illusion there.
Yeah.
Of hiding that their actual size. And it's startling when you encounter it in person. You're like, wow.
Well, and that's also talking of size. That's why I start with Twizzle, because it's important to consider that they were running straight from making one production straight into another. So the scale that was determined as, well, this is the size our puppet should be, that was determined on Twizzle. The puppet bridge was built in the Islet Park ballroom to be that size. Sets, the stages, everything was, built around, that's the size and the scale that we're working with. And so with each advancement of puppet, they're not going to rebuild the whole studio with each new iteration. So they're always working to that size. And it's why Supermarionation has that slight appeal of, even if the proportions are slightly different, you can tell all these puppets do sort of inhabit the same world in that sense. Like, it's always 1/3 scale, even if the heads get bigger or smaller or whatever it is. But it all stems from decisions that were made, in the ballroom of Islet Park. And it's incredible that had to be translated to so many different facilities over the years. And just one.
It reminds me of there was a discussion about, and this was a meme a few years ago, so some of our viewers and listeners may know about this. There was a discussion about, why is the space shuttle the size that it is? Why did the space shuttle? Well, it's because they had to transport the components of the space shuttle to and from various places by rail. There was no other way to transport something that big and heavy other than by rail. And railroads are the size that they are because that's the size that the ancient Roman roads were. Like that's the
Yeah,
size that roads have been since the ancient Roman times. So
that's it.
someone decided, in ancient Roman times how big roads were going to be, and that standard has gone all the way through. And it's the same with these puppets. Some
Yeah,
of the same ideas that were the groundwork was laid all the way back at Twizzle go all the way forward to the very end.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So
Extraordinary.
that's why I think it's important that you look at early shows like, yes, all right, it's fun to make fun of Torchy. It's very easy to make fun of Torchy, but from a filmmaking historical perspective,
Yeah.
there's a lot of value in there in looking at the early stuff because you do
Yeah.
see it carry through. You see the beginnings of ideas that
Yeah.
would later come to fruition.
It adds an extra layer of enjoyment to watching the
Exactly.
later stuff, to see
Yeah.
what they came from and what they took with them and what they left behind.
Exactly. So then we go from Supercar into Fireball
Bum bum
XL5.
bum.
Yes. So here we
Bum.
go. I'm gonna hold up
Who
the
have we
piece
got?
of
Who
paper
have we got?
again, and we're gonna
Woo!
Steve Zodiac missing his arm. I
What's
had to cut
happened to
his hand
Steve?
off.
Steve!
Well, I wanted to use a color photo, so I was like, well, I'm kind of limited in how many color photos
This-
show the full
This is
length of the puppet.
definitely.
So there we
He
go.
looks like Space Pirate Zodiac.
Yeah.
In that he needs. You should draw a little hook hand on.
Oh, that would be lovely. Wouldn't that be splendid?
Pirates.
But yeah, the main distinction I would make between supercar puppets and Fireball puppets is that these were sort of the first, I believe, the first sort of set of hero puppets. Obviously, guest puppets would be designed in-house, but the first set of hero puppets that were designed by the AP Films team themselves. So people like Mary Turner, Christine Glanville, John Blundell, all of those people were basically sculpting the faces, and that is how those ideas for, rather than being, I mean, they might have sketched stuff on paper as well, I suppose, but it sounds to me when they describe it in interviews and things like that, is the process of creating a new face was done in the clay. Like that's how they brought them to life. And I think it produces some interesting results. It produces some different results in the Fireball puppets. I'll be honest, I probably find the Fireball puppets the least appealing out of all of them.
I kind of prefer the supercar puppets too.
Right.
I'm not sure
Can
why.
you put your finger on why? Because it's a real struggle to define exactly what it is that feels off about the Fireball puppets. But
I think it's something to do with the eyes in a way.
Right. So at that stage, they were still using sort of ping pong ball, like wooden eyes that were painted. So they're sort of solid. There's no glossiness to them. And they were still using that on Fireball.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that has something to do with it, but
I feel
because... sorry, go ahead.
Ironically, the eyes of the Fireball puppets are a bit more realistically painted, whereas the supercar ones are a bit more simplistic. But there's a stronger contrast that gives them a kind of intensity of focus.
Yes,
which is part of why people always notice the eyes on the supercar puppets. They're like,
yeah.
Beaker's eyes really
definitely.
Beaker's eyes really have a zero in on you, and it makes them feel alive. It may be unsettling or not quite the desired effect, but it definitely gives them a liveliness.
Yeah.
That the Fireball puppets tend to lack. Not all of them. Some of them are better than others.
Yeah,
Steve Zodiac in particular, his
the
eyes
Fireball,
are quite right.
The eyes on the Fireball puppets are set into the head in a way that's supposed to be more realistic,
and it is.
But because other features are still quite exaggerated, so that's really okay on Steve Zodiac. I think that one works for me, but it's on characters. Venus is an odd one.
Let's talk about Venus, because there's a big step forward there too, in terms of how they were approaching puppetry.
Is there?
Yeah.
I was gonna talk about how I don't like the puppet of Venus very much.
I don't like the
to
puppet of
be honest.
Venus very much either, but she's the first specifically female sculpted one in
Oh,
terms
of
of
course.
body
Yeah,
shape.
no.
So that was a big step forward for them
Well, I
to
mean,
do
you
that.
had Mar Jones on Four Feather Falls, but
Yeah.
that's an odd case in and of itself. So
I
yeah,
don't
maybe
know
you're
I
right.
don't know about the construction of Maud Jones specifically. Did she have the head on top of the neck as opposed to the head that's
Oh, I
attached to
see
the
what you
neck?
mean now. Yeah, I don't know, but yes, do talk
Yeah.
about that. Actually, no, I understand where you're going now.
Later on in the later puppets starting around this time, they started doing a different thing with the female characters where in order to so that they could wear lower cut dresses and have a bit more chest, for lack of a better word, they started sculpting them so the male characters all have like a main chest torso piece, and then the head
Mhm.
and the neck is all of one piece separately. So the joint where they move is actually right here. So they kind of move when they turn their heads, their neck moves with them.
It's at
Whereas
the
the
base of the neck rather than the top. Yeah.
right for the male characters, but the female
Yeah.
characters, the torso piece of the puppet includes the neck, so that the join is actually at the top of the neck. So
Right.
the head itself sort of swivels on top. I think I've
Yeah.
explained that okay.
Yeah, I
It's
think so. I
a
think
little
go
bit
watch the
a little
show.
bit
If you don't
confusing.
know what Ben's talking about, go watch one of the go and
You
watch any
you
of the
you will see it.
Supermarionation
It's
shows and you'll see
particularly
it.
apparent with, like, Marina and Atlanta. If you
Yes.
compare Marina and Atlanta to Troy and Phones, you can see there's clearly a different approach to the way that they're sculpted and designed as puppets
Yes.
because they're male and female, which I
Right.
think is a really
Exactly.
lovely, touch. I think it
Yeah.
really adds an extra dimension, and it's a step forward in terms of, gender representation in these shows, although but
Yeah.
again, Venus
Not in the way it's written though, unfortunately.
Venus is not a step forward in the way that it's
Yeah.
written as a
Yeah.
character. So,
That's true. Or at least the way she's treated by other characters.
but yeah, tell
Great.
me more
Yeah.
about why you don't like Venus as a puppet.
It's the fixed smile.
Ah,
Talking
yes.
about female puppets, the fact that
Uh-huh.
the one female character is the one that where they fixed her with a smile through the whole thing, even when she's having a horrible time of it being tortured by some alien baddie,
Yeah.
she's still grinning away, and it just doesn't quite fit right. And then I would say the other problem is, and it's a problem that's consistent actually on quite a few of the Fireball puppets, is the lip movement is very restricted on a character like Venus. I don't think they quite nailed how much the mouth needed to open
Hmm.
for it to not look weird. But I definitely find that on there's other characters where that happens as well. People like Commander Zero as well
Hmm.
has a very broad, fixed facial expression where his mouth is again several miles wide.
Yeah.
And when it opens, it sort of doesn't feel like it opens far enough. So it feels just a bit awkward. It just doesn't quite feel like it's performing the way it's supposed to perform. There feels like there's a restriction there that just
Yeah.
doesn't quite work for me. That's why I do find it slightly harder to watch. And then you do still in Fireball get some pretty extreme guest characters with
Yes.
very very caricatured faces, and when you put them
Yes.
alongside a character like Steve Zodiac, yeah, that
Yeah.
just
It's
doesn't quite work. There's a weird meshing of styles there where they're trying to
yeah.
push forward in some ways and they're being held back in others. But
We like to think of it as a linear progression where it's like, oh, it just they get a little bit better each time. But there's also an element of it where it's sometimes it's a bumpy journey. It's not always smooth.
yeah. Well, and we know that they're in within the puppet department, there were people advocating for different things. John
Yes,
Blundell
famous.
famously was very much in favor of big heads, caricatured expressions, leaning into what puppets do well, as you say, like puppeteers say, well, the strength is in not in trying to make them do something they're not, which arguably is what Supermarionation tried to do the whole time. So you've got John Blundell creating these big, very just big expressions on the puppets' faces.
Parker being the most famous John Blundell.
Yeah, Parker definitely being the sort of pinnacle of all that, or at least the most kind of it's a standout example, because the Thunderbirds, most of the Thunderbirds puppets go one way, Parker kind of goes the other. Whereas people like Mary Turner and Christine Glanville were kind of more on board with the idea of, well, let's make these puppets look like movie stars.
Right.
And in that way, I think they do succeed. But yes, there is therefore a sort of clashing of styles there that sometimes it produces interesting results. The other thing to point out about Fireball is that you've kind of got lots of alien guest characters turning up.
Yes, all kinds of weird and wonderful.
Yeah, which is funny because so many of them, considering an alien could look like anything. It could be a tentacle with, tentacles. Not the whole thing. It could be a squid with tentacles. It could just be a tentacle on its own with flapping about, looking
a tentacle with lots of little tentacles all along. Yeah.
Okay.
I like that. That's good.
Yeah. Well, there you go. But the point, you could, when you're dealing with puppets, yes, Ben, I like your tentacles.
Sorry.
Your tentacles.
I'll put my tentacles away now.
Yeah. Very distracting. When you're dealing with puppets, obviously, you could do whatever you want. You can make your tentacle character, or you can make them look like humanoids. And the interesting thing is that most of the alien characters in Fireball, and the same applies with Stingray later, is they're all just humanoid shapes, but the faces have been painted an interesting color, and they've been, like we talked about last week with Treasure Down Below, they'll stick a candelabra on the top of their head and go, well, that's your alien. So it's interesting that in a realm of puppetry would allow you to do anything you want and do lots of weird and wonderful designs for these alien creatures. It's interesting that they didn't do that. They instead decided, no, we'll stick with the standard puppet body and just put an interesting head on top.
I read an interview with Keith Wilson talking about this very subject recently.
Okay.
Where he was talking about doing production design on Space 1999.
Right.
And he was like, we found that we could design a plant. And, they would say, this has to be a totally alien plant. We don't want it to look anything like what you would see on Earth.
Right.
And we would go crazy and we would come up with this bizarre thing. And they would all look at it and go, but it doesn't say plant to me. It's not going to read as a plant on screen. And I think there's an element of that with the Fireball XL5 characters too, where it's like that in order to communicate that they are characters that are opposed to us, they have to read as characters that we can be opposed to. And therefore, there has to be an element of recognition and familiarity that people can hang their hats on to understand. And so even in a form like puppetry, where you could do anything, you still have to abide by some of the rules of communication, which is like starting with something familiar that you both, the filmmakers and the audience, know about.
Right.
So I think that's probably the reason why that is. I do love when Fireball XL5 goes off the deep end and has a brain in a jar, or a plant man character who's very abstract.
John Blundell, again, going with the abstract. I'm pretty sure he designed the space monster as well.
I believe so, yeah. There's certainly a lot of pictures of him with it. So I think he was the one.
It's interesting, that maybe he was the one given those assignments, and
yes,
cool niche to carve out for yourself of, okay, I do the weird aliens, okay.
Yes.
Yeah. But one other sort of notable thing about Fireball is the blinker heads start to make an appearance.
How do you feel about the blinker heads, Jack? Just in general.
Well, it's interesting. It depends on what they're trying to I think they use the blinker heads for a lot of different purposes. It's almost a bit of calling them blinker heads doesn't accurately describe what they're meant for, I think, because obviously, you know, a puppet, if it were a real person, should blink every few seconds. That's what
Sure.
blinking is for. But really what those blinker heads are supposed to represent is a character becoming weary or in some kind of distress. It's almost, at least in Fireball, it's a substitute for sort of sadness sometimes in a way. Not used on every character. I'm pretty sure Steve had one. I think Venus had one, and that was about it, really. So it's interesting that they kind of introduced it sparingly. But essentially what they did, as far as how they realized it, is a Supermarionation puppet would have its eyes would be able to pivot left and right, and in the blinker puppets, instead of going left and right, they go up and down, which is very clever solution to a problem that must have been like, how on earth do we make these puppets blink? It's like, oh no, we'll just swap it round. We'll paint eyelids on the eyeballs and have them go up and down. I think that's really a really clever solution to it.
Clever and simple.
Yeah.
Do you know at what point they switched to? So when the Supermarionation puppets change expression, they swap heads.
Yes.
So before they introduced blinker heads, at some point they started swapping in different heads for certain facial expressions. Do you know around when that happened, roughly?
So that's a Stingray innovation.
Okay.
I don't think it happens apart from the blinker heads in Fireball. The Fireball expressions are fixed.
Yeah.
And that's why I was talking about Venus, how she's got that permanent smile on her face regardless of what's happening. But
it's funny because in my mind, Mike Mercury's face changes expression all the time. But
well, there you go. That's the magic of it. That's totally in your imagination. The only caveat to that is they would sometimes, if a character was asleep, they would put plasticine eyelids over the top of the eyes just to make them look closed. And in one instance, in Four Feather Falls, again, Four Feather Falls being the sort of amazing, innovative production that it was, there's a particular shot of a character whistling. Probably happens a few times in Four Feather Falls, actually. And they actually sculpt on and stick it on top of the face like a whistling mouth with cheeks blown out and everything. I think it looks great. It's amazing. But
that is amazing.
Yeah, specially sculpted just for that moment. But yeah, no, Stingray was when they kind of came along and said, we need to have multiple expressions. So there you go. There's my comparison between Steve and Troy.
Yep. Thanks, Steve. You're not as armless as you look.
Yeah. But it's interesting because in terms of the hero puppets, maybe not that much difference, maybe not that much noticeable difference between the Stingray puppets and the Fireball puppets.
A small,
but there were
a significant
subtle changes being made, like the introduction of glass eyes replacing the wooden ones, which I think probably even more, maybe more so than the automatic mouth movement, actually. I think the introduction of those glass eyes, just the perfect thing. Do you know how to put into words what it is that makes such a difference when it comes to those eyes? Because I think it is important.
I think, it's again, with communication, it's signals that we're meant to identify with them. And that's the first, usually when you're talking to somebody, the thing that you look at is their eyes. So that's an immediate and a key part of facial recognition as well, is looking at someone's eyes. So I think eyes are absolutely key to to connecting with a puppet and creating a character.
Yeah.
So that's, it actually, you could take the same face. You could take Troy Tempest's face, take out the glass eyes from William Shakespeare, which, strangely enough, was the name of the man who made the glass eyes.
Yeah. I thought for a moment there, I was like, who's digging up Shakespeare and like scooping his eyes? No, you're talking about the man who made the eyes happened to be called William Shakespeare.
You could dig out Shakespeare's eyes from Troy's face and put in a pair of XL5 eyes in the exact same head, but it would be a totally different character, totally different experience.
Well, that's interesting because they do that. actually, sort of. In the case of Admiral Denver, started out as a Fireball XL5 puppet, General Rossiter in Space City Special. He actually appears. Okay, he appears in Treasure Down Below, which we reviewed last week on the podcast, as a puppet, but with his original Fireball XL5 eyes that are painted. And then when he became, and he just appears as like the cafe owner, he's just in the background of a scene. And then when he reappears as Admiral Denver later, he's had his eyes swapped out for glass ones. Sounds like a horrible surgery that they were put under, but no, I'm sure a very straightforward operation of just swapping.
Extremely routine, nothing to worry about.
Yeah, it's just weird when you describe it so casually. Oh, they swapped their eyes out. Yeah, it's no big deal. But yeah, so there is a very good example, actually, if you want to compare General Rossiter in Fireball to Admiral Denver in Stingray, you can see the difference that the glass eyes make. As Countdown to Zero says in the chat, a glint of reflection in glass eyes suggests there's a soul in there.
Yes.
Yes. But that's pure. That's magic. I have no scientific way of describing to you why that works better. It just sort of does. So there you go. That's what I have to say about that.
I do think it's magic, but I'm sure there's some neuroscience explanation that's out there. I just don't know it.
If we have any neuroscientists listening in, please let us know. But yeah, the other thing, as you pointed out with the Stingray puppets, is the alternate facial expressions. So we get the introduction of smiler heads and frowning heads, and obviously we have the blinker heads as well. Obviously there's the neutral expression. Was there anything else? I feel like I'm missing one. Frowner, blinker,
I don't think so at this point.
Neutral. Yeah. And obviously they also made replicas of only of the neutral head they made a replica of, but so that they could shoot two puppet units shooting episodes simultaneously.
Right.
Yeah. And
they lean really heavily into the facial copying of, casting a face of a famous person in Stingray.
Yes. Go on then. What are some of the famous ones? Yeah, James Garner in Troy.
James Garner being the most obvious there for Troy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just an interesting thing because they sort of get into this mode of trying to control every little detail of the production.
Right.
And trying to literally this is the point where they start to craft a miniature version of our world almost.
Yes.
Where it's like here's what James Garner would look like if he was about that tall.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's great though. It's something that was not, as far as I know anyway, was not being done. You wouldn't conceive of doing that with puppetry at the time, probably because you would think, well, why not just make a show with the real James Garner? But it's interesting, isn't it? That's just where the innovation kind of comes in, and what makes the show so unique and special. They're doing something that really on paper doesn't make any sense at all.
No, because I think if you ask John Blundell, he would be like, "Well, we shouldn't do that." I think he would have been opposed to that practice from the very get-go, but I don't know. It's interesting. It's an interesting approach to be like, well, we'll just take their likeness and kind of approximate it. I wonder if you did that today, what sort of repercussions there might be, or if indeed they faced any repercussions back then of having faces. Yeah, there are certainly actors who come forward and said, "Oh, that puppet was based on me."
Yeah,
but unless it's difficult to prove, and
they always when they talk about the description of that process, it was, and Sylvia actually in an interview described it really well, where it was like they would call it a composite face, where they would take the eyes of someone, the nose of someone else, the mouth of someone else. But ultimately, I think there maybe was a bit of, let's try and make this look like that person. Or maybe the brief would be, hey, do a face like that person. And so the sculptor would go, well, I'll do that then. So yeah, interesting process, but it does make it quite enjoyable. It's very, very fun. That's something you can kind of look out for. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think we've put this off long enough. We're gonna go now from Stingray into
To Captain Scarlet? Oh,
no. There's one little show that we need to pay attention to
I
first.
skipped over the one in the middle. Sorry.
Yeah, that one in the middle. It's called Thunderbirds. Not many, you won't have heard of it. It's not that
No.
big of a deal, really. I'll tell you what. Printing out these pictures, trying to find a non-altered original full-length picture of any Thunderbirds puppet on the internet. My goodness me, is that difficult? I kept finding pictures of Scott when you Google Scott Tracy, you get what do you get? You get the Big Chief Studios puppet, you get the standard stock photo, which is the Series 2 head pasted on top of a Series 1 body. You get the CGI series, you get all sorts. So trying to find an image of a Thunderbirds puppet, really, really difficult. I just wanted to put that out there. Just
well done.
Yeah,
thank you for your hard work and sacrifice to find that picture and print it out for us today.
I know, so much work.
Everyone in the chat, give Jack a round of applause for his sacrifice. Trolling through the lengths of Google images to try to find that picture of Scott. We really appreciate it, Jack. Bravo.
Bravo. All right. Well, now I feel silly. Thank you so much. Right. Well, Thunderbirds puppets.
Yeah, what happened with the Thunderbirds puppets?
What happened with the Thunderbirds? I mean, to be honest, in the grand scheme of things, at least initially, not a lot changed. There is a distinction between the Stingray style of puppets and the Thunderbird style, but it's again quite hard to define exactly what it is that made the difference. But you can definitely tell, like when you look at an episode like Trapped in the Sky, you can see the style evolving, and certainly by the time you get to the end of Thunderbirds, you can tell that something has changed, where the caricatures are just not quite so apparent. Obviously, Parker is an exception to that, but even then, there is there's just just really high quality finish to the puppets. Like everything is smooth, everything is carefully placed. There's just no element of, and I would hardly call the Stingray puppets sloppy, but like there is no element of that will do kind of thing. It's like, no, we are going to get this absolutely perfect. I think that's so important to why the Thunderbirds puppets appeal so much. It's because there is nothing about them that I would say is ugly at that point.
Okay.
I don't know, people might disagree with that, but I would say they're the most, just as objects, they are sculpted to be quite good looking things. So I think that's very important.
They pretty much nailed that style that they were developing from Four Feather Falls on, of human puppets in that scale, of that style, where it's like a little bit caricatured but not too much. That's, sort of like the Stingray Thunderbirds era. Somewhere in there is where they just about nailed it and got it as good as it was ever going to get.
Yeah.
And
well, Willow in the chat makes a really good point. The Thunderbirds puppets have more features that feel human. Little things like Virgil's eyebrow scar and crinkles around Jeff's eyes.
Oh yeah,
it shines out of the sculpt, unlike the Stingray ones, and that's it. It's they're actually embracing little imperfections and trying to get those details in that. Yeah, probably if you were describing to a puppeteer, oh, make a James Garner style face, you would make it as perfect, as handsome, absolutely, spot on as possible. Same thing kind of applies to Steve Zodiac. It's like, well, we've got these hero characters here, so they have to look perfect. And actually, what's important and what makes those characters feel more human, as Willow says, it's the little details, the little imperfections that are really, really important. And who knows how many of those things were intentional. Like, I had never noticed Virgil having like an eyebrow scar or anything like that, but I'm sure it's there. I don't doubt that it's there. It's just not something I'd even picked up on. But it is important.
Good shout, Willow. It's true.
Yeah. But things like, there's also the nature of the stories change things a little bit. For example, no more aliens. Not a single one in Thunderbirds, sadly. At least not in the TV show. The only animal character that I could think of that appears in Thunderbirds that is a puppet, anyway, is Kathleen the cow that appears in Operation Crash Dive. That is a puppet.
Kathleen the cow, maybe an alligator tail.
Yeah,
or possibly a little alligator, but they're really more like special effects the way the alligators are done.
So this is a world that very much reflects our own. Where these are,
and that's a change that's reflected in the voiceover as well. Changes the way that the approach to the voiceover changes significantly between.
We should talk about that, because the voices are an important part of what brings those puppets to life. It's not the only part, but
compare Shane Rimmer's delivery to that of Don Mason. No shade on either of them. They're doing two different things. I think they both do great work playing different characters, but Shane Rimmer's delivery of Scott Tracy is very much a grounded kind of persona. Whereas Don Mason's Troy Tempest, while he's still a really strong character, is definitely more caricatured, is definitely more heightened, a bit more, dare we say it, camp than Scott Tracy.
Well, we could use that word. Yes. I think camp will be accurate. Yeah.
So it's a totally different approach, and that kind of ripples through the rest of the characterizations too, where everything is achingly sincere. Even some of the broader character voices are done with a kind of sincerity. There's absolutely no the camp factors dialed way down.
Yeah,
unless it's Matt Zimmer.
Well, well, but it's in a weird way. It's also just kind of acceptable. There's certain things, the way Alan Tracy speaks, that you look at that face and you just go, it just fits together. I think there was definitely more of a conscious effort to match faces to voices.
Yes.
In a way, I think they had refined. That's probably Sylvia Anderson has to.
I was going to say, I suspect
that's still that part of the process of casting voices to match faces, or altering faces possibly to match voices. I don't know. Depends which way around that was going, but that was like the famous story Matt Zimmerman tells is, oh, you've got the same dimple on your chin that Alan has, so you should you already fit, just the face alone fits it, but the voice as well. It's actually particularly interesting with Alan because he was recast. You have Ray Barrett voicing him in Trapped in the Sky, and then Matt Zimmerman comes along, and you go, boy, what a difference that makes. And obviously you say that with hindsight because we're so used to Matt Zimmerman's voice for Alan, but there's definitely something about that young, boyish face that requires a voice to match. And I think, Thunderbirds does an exceptional job at, where to dial things in terms of that.
And good shout crediting Sylvia for that, because I think that's one of her primary contributions that makes the biggest positive difference. It's a huge
well,
difference.
And it's interesting as well, because when you talk about her as Penelope, we talked about when we reviewed Trapped in the Sky, how her delivery of Penelope's lines it's a different type of delivery that she's doing in Trapped in the Sky compared to what comes later for Penelope.
Right.
And she's where it's comes across, I don't know how you describe it, slightly colder, slightly more aloof, I suppose. In Trapped,
it's more breathy
compared to what comes later. Yeah, more breathy. And So even she was going in thinking, how do I make my voice match what this face is expressing? And obviously it's her face as well. Whether she was how aware she was of that, I mean, she certainly became aware of it later, but I don't know whether initially that was something she was conscious of. But yeah, it's that's a whole interesting situation there of how do I come up with a new voice for a character that looks exactly like me. Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be a challenge to say, okay, I've got to reimagine myself in a fictional version. It's almost as if, someone like Nick Park or an Aardman animator was like, "Oh, I'm going to cast myself in Wallace and Gromit. What
Yeah.
sort of a character would I be?" You have to have like a really intense self-awareness to
Yes.
kind of be very aware of like what you look like and how how you might be caricatured, but also how to take to find an aspect of yourself that you can lean into and
Yeah.
make a broad cartoonish version of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
don't know that Sylvia. I mean, it's interesting because we don't really know too much about what the thought process was there as far as the creation of Lady Penelope. If she
Yeah.
felt like she was making herself in some way, or if she felt
Well,
like it was an
it's
aristocratic part of
interesting
herself
because
or not. But
first of all, the story obviously Gerry says that he didn't originally want to cast Sylvia as that voice at all. So that's one direction you're coming at it from. Then you've got Mary Turner creating the face, and the story goes that they were never quite getting it right. They never quite managed to land on it. So the advice then came, "Oh, you should make the puppet look like Sylvia. Then she'll like it." And she did. Now what that says about Sylvia, I don't know, but it's interesting the way it sort of you have all these different angles when you're creating a character, and none of it's written down.
Mhm.
In terms of no one ever made a declaration, oh, it should be this or it should be that. It just all these elements weave together, and of course now we have 60 years of history and what we now know and the way the Lady Penelope character was presented later on. It's like it all feeds into how we view it now, but at the time, yeah, who knows? Very, very difficult to place it. But yeah,
Yeah.
Penelope's interesting as a character, as a puppet, because
Mm.
no caricature there, but there must have been such a temptation to make her kind of doll like,
Mhm.
kind of. And particularly with the costumes and everything else, people talk about her as just a doll that you would dress up, but it's not that. It's not that. They've somehow managed to keep a lot of humanity in
Mm.
that puppet. That I don't know. I don't know how you would. It's really hard. Again, I just say my blanket response in those situations is just say, yeah, it's just magic. It's just how it's just that's all I can. I don't know how it works. It just does. So it's magic.
Yeah, there's
It's the magic
definitely
of puppetry.
anytime there's success, what's the expression? Success has many parents, but every failure is an orphan.
Yeah.
Uh, there's certainly a lot of different theories about why Thunderbirds works, what makes it special, why it always seems to be on the top of the pile of all these 60s Supermarionation shows. But yeah, when it comes down to it, it really is a confluence of many different things that all work.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
why do they work? You can come up with theories, and sometimes you can point to specific things, but the glue that holds it all together, it's that makes it more than the sum of its parts. If we could identify and tag what that is, then we would be billionaires, Jack.
Yeah. Exactly.
You and I, humble hosts of the Security Hazard Show.
Well, there's still time, Ben. There's still time. It could still happen for us. Head over
It's-
to patreon.com/security hazard to make Ben and I billionaires.
That was a great segue. Thank you for that.
I know.
That's great.
I know. Right. Well, the next development to talk about, because I know it's a controversial thing, is the Series 1 Thunderbirds puppets versus Series 2.
Mm.
So,
Where do
first of
you
all,
land, Jack?
where do I land? I mean, series 1, definitely.
Yeah.
But I do want to drill into why that is and why most of the people you ask will have that same reaction. Ben,
Yeah.
series 1,
Oh, yeah.
series 2?
Series
Series
1
1.
every time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the reason, but why exactly? What was it that changed in those puppet faces? You have to, it goes back to what I was saying before about the millimeters of difference
Mhm.
in those little details. That I think that makes a huge difference, because what has actually been done to change those puppets between the two series, and of course for the Thunderbirds I'll Go feature film,
Mhm.
is they've basically trimmed the eyebrows. They have repainted. There's a slightly different skin tone, a slightly more, I would say, consistent skin tone across all the characters. They've been re-wigged. Their hairstyles are much kind of tidier.
Mhm.
Um, that's about it. Obviously, certain characters, Virgil has a different voice, which
Mhm.
definitely plays into part of it and makes it feel different and a bit strange. But that's all I can really, as far as objective things that changed between
You can
those
point
two
to.
batches of puppets. That's what I can point to. Is there
Hmm.
is there anything else that I'm missing in there, or something more subjective that we should point to as well?
I think, I mean, it is tricky. I do think that there are some very minor facial sculpt differences, particularly with Virgil, I'm thinking
Okay,
of.
yeah,
Things around the eyes are different for Alan.
yeah.
Uh,
Well, Alan's, well, that comes. I think part of that comes back to the the fact that they had replica puppets for the
sure,
two units that were shooting. I
sure.
think particularly in series 2, those differences become magnified even more. And maybe it just comes down to the fact they were making so many replicas of all these different puppets.
Yeah, they were
We
working at
start to
great speed.
notice we start to notice more of those differences, which again, you're talking about tiny differences in the way that eyebrows and slight
Oh, yeah.
alterations in the face sculpt and stuff like that that happen naturally when you make anything by hand. You cannot make a perfect replica of something, so it's
Yeah.
going to be different. But there is something, yeah, that definitely starts to happen in series 2 of Thunderbirds I'll Go, where those differences are magnified and become much more noticeable, and it makes it harder to connect with a character when from
Yeah.
week to week they look ever so slightly different. It wouldn't happen in a live action TV show.
No, yeah, and it is truly a game of millimeters. I was talking to I got the opportunity to speak with Lindsay Lee, who
Mm,
sculpted, I believe Jeff was the character from the Thunderbirds anniversary episodes back
right.
in 2015 for the
Yeah.
50th anniversary. And that she was telling me about how when they constructed that puppet, there was just something not quite right. And they went through iteration after iteration, and they were working from a cast of the original puppet. So
Yeah.
theoretically, it should have been perfect,
Right.
but something wasn't quite right. And they discovered eventually through trial and error that the when they cast the puppet, they cast the front of the face, but
Right.
they didn't cast all the way back here. And so
Oh,
the length of the jaw wasn't quite right, and it was changing
wow.
the way his whole face looked, just being a few millimeters off on the length of the jaw. So that's how small and detailed it is to get
That's
the exact
extraordinary.
likeness of a character. Yeah, it's
I
quite
hadn't even considered anything like
quite
that.
detailed.
That
Yeah.
is really, really important. Yeah. Oh, yeah,
Whole
of course. Of course.
three-dimensional thing. We think about it. We tend to oversimplify it in our minds
Yeah.
to kind of capture the same way we do with a human face. If you're looking at a human being's face, you don't take in every detail of their face. You probably take in their eyes and maybe a few other things,
Yeah.
but you're not staring at every detail, every pore, unless you're an artist. Artists tend to think that way. I think when they
Yeah.
look at people's faces, it
Well,
can be a
exactly.
bit intense.
Yeah, you can. You can.
But yeah, I feel like we're
Yeah.
moving towards even bigger changes
Well,
than
I'm going to illustrate
series
it
one to
for you
season
perfectly with my
two.
sheets of paper.
Dun,
Here
dun,
we go.
dun.
This is it. This is the big change. Thunderbirds into Captain Scarlet. Realistic. Oh, I see. You were doing the drum beat. Oh, very good.
Yeah, I was trying to. Sorry. I'd like to apologize to everyone at home.
Like, Ben's having audio issues over here. It's nothing major. It's just, well, and to our audio listeners, Ben was tapping his finger. He wasn't banging his head or anything like that on the mic. Anyway, realistic proportions between Captain Scarlet and Thunderbirds, advances in electronics or whatever you want to call it, enabled them to reduce the size of the head because the electromagnet and all of that gubbins inside did not have to be as big. So they were able to make heads that were supposedly in proportion to the rest of the body. Ben.
You say supposedly.
So I say supposedly because there is an argument that the heads are too small.
Okay.
I don't know whether that just comes from being used to looking at the Thunderbirds puppets for so long. But yeah, what first of all, what prompted that move? Do you think? Why was there a desire at AP Films / Century 21 to make that change?
I think that is the central mystery of the whole Gerry Anderson story of why was that decision made? Because you look at Thunderbirds, especially with the benefit of hindsight, we look back on it and we're like, that was the one. They were on to something. And I think they felt that way at the time too, that they were on to something. And then when that ended, when that ran out of steam and they had to move on to the next thing, they just went completely to the left. They went completely off in a different direction.
Yeah.
And it's really, really interesting. In some ways, you can look at it as a continuation of the process.
Right.
Which is sort of what we're doing.
I think there's definitely an argument for that, which we've been trying to drive at of, well, we're just trying to make these puppets look the best that they can, the most. Well, there's a difference between them looking their best and them looking realistic. And I think that's where the disagreement comes about whether this was a good idea or not, because they might look more realistic, but do they look better? And actually, this is where I'm going to hand over to our audience, because I put out on social media a very simple poll. Do you prefer big heads or realistic proportions? And I got some comments back, and I'm going to read them to you now. So
please do.
On Facebook, Nick Thorne says, I think Thunderbirds ones were the best, but from Captain Scarlet onwards, I can't not like. So, that's sitting on the fence very nicely there.
Yeah.
Exo6 Future Spy says, the Thunderbirds puppets work best for me, and I don't even notice the big heads and hands. Trying to make puppets look too lifelike takes something away, in my opinion. And then Hugh Morgan says, big heads and hands for me. The realistic style was very restrictive. And then let's see, look at some YouTube comments as well. Matthew Alderman Harris says, I feel it was the right thing at the time. I don't think Thunderbirds would have worked as well with Captain Scarlet puppets and vice versa. Penguin Made of Dynamite says, definitely think the Stingray Thunderbirds puppets were the most visually wonderful. They had a lot of charm and character to their features, while the more realistic proportion puppets were great. A lot of male characters just all looked very samey. Rodimus184 says, my heart says the older, more charismatic puppets, but my brain says the more realistic proportions of the Scarlet era. And Les Paul Davis says, appreciate the caricatures of the Thunderbirds era puppets, particularly the British characters. However, I prefer the Scarlet era puppets because of the increased realism and plausibility that came with them. They also were a better visual match for the model seats of that era. I know it's been said that a puppet should look like a puppet, but to me, the more realistic puppets are just another feather in the cap of Gerry's drive for innovation. That's a lot of... And what I was happy to see there is actually quite a broad range of opinions, or at least understanding there of all the different factors that influenced this decision.
Yeah.
Because there's all sorts of arguments to be made about whether it was the right thing to do. But the thing that stood out to me was that the Thunderbirds puppets work well for Thunderbirds and the Captain Scarlet puppets work well for Captain Scarlet. Because the thing that gets called out over and over again with Captain Scarlet is the stories got darker. And that move towards realism was important because the overall tone of the show was also going in that direction. The question, I suppose, is whether the puppet style was the thing that dictated that change in tone, or whether it was the stories that made that
Dictated
impact.
puppets.
Yeah, and I imagine they sort of moved together. But it is interesting that it's not a. The reason why it's a controversial topic is because it doesn't feel like a misstep for Captain Scarlet. I feel like those realistic proportion puppets fit in that universe. But if you were to present me with a photo of one or the other, I would go, well, yeah, the bigger heads are more charming, more likable, more just something I would rather spend my time looking at.
Yeah. I like that word that someone threw in there, charismatic. I think that's
yes,
probably the right turn of phrase, where they just have a certain aspect of personality about them,
right?
that the later smaller heads don't. I tend to agree with people who feel like they tend to look more the same when you decrease the proportion of the head, and I think that is true. I think when you shrink down the head, you lose some of those amplified details, like the big eyebrows or the cleft in the chin, get missed because they're even smaller, even finer differences.
Right.
Between
there's the practical issue of, well, sculpting smaller heads means you can't physically fit more detail into the faces. I think they do get better at that. When you get to the Secret Service and the puppets that were specially created for the Secret Service, they do manage to get those details like age lines and things like that in there. But they're really, really small. So there's that practical issue of you can't physically fit the detail in there. But then there is also just the general style of, well, if we're making these realistic, people don't walk around with chins that stick out that far. But then again, they do. You do meet people with not necessarily ridiculous, like Four Feather Falls level of sticky out chins and sticky out noses and things like that. But you do meet people with, I'm going to say, exaggerated, not Hollywood perfect kind of faces.
That's true. Yes.
Yeah. It's like there is a reason why I think people can turn around and say, oh, it happens a lot, in tabloid newspapers will go, oh, so-and-so politician looks like Parker from Thunderbirds. And it's like, well, in theory, that shouldn't happen because Parker is a caricature and such an expressive, big face. You shouldn't find anyone in the world that actually looks like that. But you can't really say the same thing for the Captain Scarlet era puppets. There's a sort of genericness there. There's people can't identify the individual features of a Century 21 realistic puppet in the same way. And I think, therefore, people gravitate towards them slightly less. But, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the big flaws that they have, those smaller headed puppets, is a change in the eyes.
Yeah.
And around this time, they stopped using, because the heads were smaller, they stopped using glass eyes.
Yeah.
And started using, I believe they're plastic shells that have real photographs of real human eyes in there.
Yeah.
But there's something about it that's like the plastic would get cloudy, or of course, we know over time the pictures faded.
Yeah, that's a really unfortunate thing. If you see today any of those later puppets with the original eyes in, they've gone sort of pink and quite terrifying, really, what's happened there. But that's just an unfortunate artifact.
Misternized.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, little other things start to happen. Like you notice they don't use alternate facial expressions nearly as much
Yeah.
later on, because I suppose those expressions were, I don't know, obviously less distinctive again because the
Mm.
features are that much smaller. I also think there's something in the writing that changes there, where those sort of larger expressions are not as necessary. You
Mm-hmm.
don't get characters suddenly bursting into absolute fits of rage and fury. It's much, I suppose, more neutral
Yeah.
in style. Which so I think that's interesting as well. Um, yeah, just a whole combination. But as I say, it's not. It doesn't point to any one thing that they suddenly went, well, we're going to do realistic proportions now just because. It's like there's a whole range of factors which tie up and make it sort of forgivable, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's where I land on it.
I'm not sure I agree, really.
Right.
I would have liked to have seen a Captain Scarlet. Of course, we'll never know. We'll never know what this would have been like. So it's pure speculation on my part. I think
Mm,
it would have worked really well as a series with larger headed puppets. I think
right.
leaning into the puppetiness might have added to the kind of weird mystery of the Mysterons. Uh,
Interesting.
that could have been because there's certain episodes of Fireball XL5 that have a creepy factor
Right.
that is enhanced. Or I'm thinking of a Stingray episode actually, uh,
Invisible enemy.
Invisible Enemy, yeah,
Yeah.
where they lean into the puppety strangeness and it gives it a really uncanny factor. And of course, they do that in Captain Scarlet and do it very well with the puppets with smaller heads. But I wonder if they could have embraced that without sacrificing all the things that they had to sacrifice in order to push the technology forward into
Yeah.
the Captain Scarlet realistic proportions. Uh,
Yeah.
it, Forgivable, yes, uh, but was it necessary? Probably not.
No, I mean, yes,
But
you're right. You could have told Captain Scarlet with the bigger heads. You could have told that story, and it would have
quite
had
possibly,
a charm all
quite
of its
possibly.
own. Yeah, no, I think you're onto something there. But I do like it. I think yeah,
Oh, I do like it too.
I like
Don't get
that
me wrong.
I like that Supermarionation has these distinct eras where we can sort of point to
Yeah,
it and say I like that there is a degree of separation there. Actually, I think that is quite important. Um,
and I appreciate that
yeah,
once Jerry and Co hit the top, so to speak, with Thunderbirds, that they sort of realized rather than like going back to the drawing board and coming up with a new iteration of the same, like repeating themselves in some way,
mm,
they decided to do experimental things, and they
right.
never went back to doing anything safe ever again. I mean,
No,
Joe 90 for all of its, whatever Joe 90 is, it certainly isn't safe. It- There's
yeah,
a lot of big leaps, a lot of big storytelling jumps
there he is.
for such a little guy. Yeah,
He's
to do
so little.
those proportions.
Yeah, to think, oh,
in-
we've made all our puppets a lot smaller, and all the puppeteers are complaining about not being able to sculpt as much detail into the face. I know, let's do a child character who is absolutely tiny and make
Smaller.
him the lead character of the whole thing.
The
It's
hubris of
ex-
it is
it's
amazing.
it's something, yeah. But obviously, yeah, the interesting thing that then starts to happen with the 3 Century 21 Supermarionation productions going, from Scarlet to Joe 90 to Secret Service,
Mm,
they share a cast of puppets, guest characters that remains the same all the way through. There's
mhm.
very little change that starts to happen. The so it's interesting you say they don't rest on their laurels. I agree in terms of format, they keep trying to do new and weird things, but there is a sense that the puppet stages have peaked or stopped or just aren't they've kind of hit a wall. They can't
Yeah.
really go any further. as far as developing this craft is concerned. So it remains the same. It remains in a kind of economical way. It remains the same in the sense
Yes.
that they make hardly, when it comes to Joe 90 and the Secret Service, hardly any new puppets are made at all for those shows, apart from a few of the lead characters. So that's interesting. One other development I want to talk about, and it's to be honest, in the grand scheme of things, actually, it should feel more significant than it is the under control puppets.
Yes.
Rather than being operated from strings from above, when they had a scene in a cockpit where it was like, well, we can't get strings in there, they would control the puppets from underneath. I think there's a reason that those are used quite sparingly. You would have thought, oh, well, it gets rid of the strings, and Gerry always complains about the strings, so surely everything would be done under control. But I think there's a reason why you don't see those under control puppets very much. It's because they don't work very well. The movement suddenly becomes stiff, and you're already talking about one of the other complaints about the realistic proportion puppets is they become more stiff because the balance of weight in things like the arms and the heads is slightly off kilter, so it's very hard to get them to move. Well, to get them to move, period. It's just much harder. Then you get to the under control puppets, and there's even more of a stiffness to the way that they move. That means they just don't. It just doesn't come together very well. So I think that's the reason why they're used less, less than you would expect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Years later, Christine Glanville would do an interview talking about Terrorhawks, where they were asking, how are these puppets different? And she said, I think they're actually better because they're under controlled, that we have like direct contact with the puppet in a way that you don't when you're 6 feet above them, controlling wires. And I think that there's some truth to that. I think that's why they continued to use them, because they were using them, in Thunderbird 6, and there's appearances of them. They never really got rid of them. So I think they're very useful. But yeah, there's a lot of limitations. There's a reason that babies have larger heads than grown people. There's actual physics to that. When something is smaller, the proportions of like how you hold yourself is different. And I'm not explaining this very well, but it is a real thing.
I don't know what it is you're explaining. You just suddenly started talking about babies' heads. I'm very what?
So in terms of like the balance of the Thunderbirds puppets, how they stand on their own 2 feet better than the Captain Scarlet puppets do, which is actually why the Captain Scarlet puppets don't move very much, is because if they move, they tend to swing, and they look more puppety.
Yes.
Because they're lighter, and because the balance isn't quite right. And when you scale a person down, if you actually physically scaled a person down to that size, they wouldn't balance as well either.
Right. I see.
And I know that from building puppets that are a realistic proportion, and you're like, oh, you would think like, oh, I'm just going to build it like a person is, and it'll balance, the weight will balance out perfectly if you put everything in the same place. But that doesn't appear to be true. And I think there's something to do with babies in that too. Why babies have bigger heads.
We'll work on people. We'll work on that theory. We'll keep refining that as the weeks go on. I'm sure we'll get there. But you mentioned Thunderbird 6. It is worth bringing up Thunderbird 6 just because we have this weird compromise that happens between the decision being made. We're going to make all new puppets for Thunderbird 6, where the proportions are somewhere in between.
Transatlantic.
Transatlantic's a good word for it, actually.
Between the ocean between Thunderbirds and Captain Scarlet.
Yeah.
Thunderbird 6 is the middle ground.
Yeah. Which I quite like the Thunderbird 6 puppets. I think
I do too.
There is a slight coldness to them, but they for the most part, they look like what they're meant to look like.
Yeah.
I think.
Again, it's difficult to separate because of the story is also a lot more distant We don't
Yeah.
feel like they're the same characters. There's not the
Right.
warmth that you get in earlier Thunderbirds.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
that's a factor. The skin tone is always weird to me in Thunderbird 6. They changed the color of
Yeah.
your skin, and
Yeah.
it's particularly noticeable in that, even more so than the difference between Block 1 and Block 2 of Thunderbirds.
Yes. Yeah.
There's
There's
an even
definitely
stronger change of
Again,
skin.
it's whether you it's a shame because oh, really that shouldn't have been a conversation they had at all. Like
Mm.
you can't possibly change the proportion of a person and expect people to accept them as being the same person.
Well, unless it's a baby.
If I suddenly, unless it's a baby. But even then, you look at a baby and go, well, you were cuter when you had a bigger head. Now you've all grown up and your head is the right size. You're not quite as cute as you used to be.
True.
So you wouldn't dare to look at a person and go, well, if we make your head the right size, then people will still accept you as the same person. It's weird to me that was even a conversation that they had, where it was like, well, we could make the Thunderbirds puppets realistic proportion now.
Uh-huh.
Like, no, that would turn them into totally different people. So I think with Thunderbird 6, they just about get away with it. They took it as close to the line as they possibly could. And actually, they do use some Thunderbirds I'll Go puppet heads. Like Commander Casey from Thunderbirds I'll Go shows up as Jim Glenn in Thunderbird 6. So they do still use some of the bigger heads. So it must be such a small change in proportions that it's probably not even that noticeable to most people. But, you know, if you've watched it as much as we have for our sins, you know, you will notice those slight differences. But yeah. Then, just going back to the Secret Service, of course.
Did you print out Stanley Unwin for us?
I did print out Stanley Unwin for you. There he is.
Hey,
holding his case. And the question for you, Ben, is this a puppet of Stanley Unwin, or is it the real Stanley Unwin? Can you
I can't
tell.
I can't tell. No, it's clearly a puppet.
Right.
Clearly a printout of a puppet in your hand.
Yes. Well, that's the thing, though, isn't it? Because at this point, someone at Century 21 had the expectation that these puppets are miniature people. They are exactly the same. There is no distinction between a puppet and a human at this point, and you can therefore marry the two together on film, and it should be seamless.
I admire the audacity to do that. Yeah. I think it's an incredible experiment in television. I'm so glad that it exists.
Yeah.
It's a fool's errand.
Yeah.
I mean, it's absolute insanity. And even, you know, you can build a case for the Captain Scarlet puppets, you know, all the way back to John Blundell and even like Joy Laurie, the different approach that Joy Laurie had as a puppeteer to what Gerry Anderson and the higher ups at Century 21 were striving for. You know, there's always an argument to be made, caricatures versus realism. But I think everyone agrees at some point they just crossed a Rubicon. And by the time you get to the Secret Service, the Rubicon has definitely been crossed.
Yeah.
And there is no going back from that. It's quite a thing.
We talked about a few episodes back, episode 4 of the podcast, where we were talking about how the Secret Service continued. I think we agreed that they had reached a point with the Secret Service where they knew it wasn't working.
Yeah.
And the story started to reflect that inherent silliness that came with, oh yeah, puppets and people are exactly the same. So it loops back around then.
It does.
Back into that weird fantasy land where nothing is real and it's all a bit strange. Yeah.
Yeah. Everything's a bit twee. We're back to
everything
being
becomes a bit twee. That's it. Oh my god. Wow. God, we're clever. Come all the way back round.
I don't know how clever we are.
There we go. I mean,
for that.
that but that brings us to the end of the Supermarionation story, with one exception.
What's
One
that?
exception. Well, that's
What's
the
that?
investigator, and I'm not
The
going to spend too long
investigator.
talking about the investigator, because frankly, those puppets are ugly. There's no two ways about it. You can admire a Captain Scarlet puppet or a Joe 90 or a Secret Service puppet for being, presentable, good-looking characters in their own right. But when you come to John and Julie in the investigator, something's gone very, very wrong there.
What
It's in
went
the
wrong?
eyes.
It's the eyes.
It is just the eyes.
What happened to the eyes?
I don't know. They're yellow.
Eyes
They're the
are
wrong color. They just not right. Just not right. Just wrong.
Yeah.
But I think
Very
it's
strange.
possibly also the way they're photographed as well is kind of all wrong. But that's a whole topic for another day. I think for most people, it
journey
ends
ends.
with the Secret Service. And
In
yeah.
1969 with the
Yeah.
Secret Service.
So for you, Ben, when someone says a Supermarionation puppet, what do you think of?
Well, I tend
What
to
are the key
default
features?
to the key features. I think of the bigger heads. I think of the human-esque. They're human-esque. They're not exactly human. They're sort of, I don't know. It's hard to put into words other than that. There's a kind of like they're caricatured, but not too caricatured.
Yeah.
They just hit a perfect balance. I mean, it's a perfect balance for me. Not everyone agrees. But I think everyone listening to this probably agrees. There's a balance that's struck.
Yes.
Around the like Stingray Thunderbirds era, where they really nailed it.
Yeah.
And they figured out something very special and unique.
What I appreciate is that there are these different shows that have a more refined version of it and maybe a more primitive version, and there's something for everyone in there. Supermarionation is not just one thing. People would immediately think, it's puppets with electronic lips. I don't know why I always do that wiggly finger thing when I'm talking about lip sync, but
yeah, what's up with your tentacle?
I don't know. Something about that little tentacle keeps wanting to come out whenever I talk about puppet lips. Don't know why that is. But yeah, but that's what people think of. They think of the electronic lip sync, and I hope what our discussion has prompted is the fact that it's more than one thing. There's so many elements just in the puppets alone. We haven't even we talked a little bit about it, but we haven't even really talked about the cinematography or the editing or the voices or all the other elements that come together to make those puppets look as good as they do. But we wanted to just kind of narrow it down to the puppets.
Yeah. In a weird way, the mouth movement is
wiggly finger.
I'm wiggling my finger now if you're listening on audio. In a weird way, the mouth movement is the least important aspect of what makes them what they are. In a weird way, that's the aspect that's named, Supermarionation. That's the part that was the technological breakthrough, so to speak.
Right.
But the things that make them unique in what they are, and recently David Fincher did a music video for the Red Hot Chili Peppers. That's on Netflix. It's part of Love, Death, and Robots, I think, is the series.
Right.
When he was like, we're going to make these CGI characters in a Thunderbird style, they don't have the lip movement mouth thing that the Thunderbirds puppets have. I think they actually have corners on their mouths like Twizzle. But, it doesn't really matter. It's not what makes them unique characters. It's something intangible beyond that. That's more in their design and less in their circuitry.
That's
for
it.
lack of a better comparison.
Oh, that's good. Supermarionation. It's in the design, not the circuitry. Love it.
I'm gonna get that tattooed.
Yeah. Absolutely. We're always talking about getting tattoos on this show. It's weird. I would never do it. Never do it. Anyway.
No, you wouldn't get a matching tattoo with me, Jack?
No.
We could get like, I could get the S part of your security hazard logo, and you could get the H, and then when we get together, we could put them together and make the logo. Like, no, you're not into that.
No. I mean, we're friends, but you know,
Yeah.
don't like you that much. And on that sour note, everyone, thank you very much for listening to the Security Hazard Show. We are broadcasting every single week. We do it live on YouTube.
It's so live.
YouTube.com/Jack Noel. It's so live. Every Wednesday, 6 p.m. UK time. So please tune in live if you can. We love reading out your comments and chat as we go through the show. You can subscribe on YouTube, watch and listen. You can also watch us in real time, but you can also catch up later on YouTube, as well as find lots of other Gerry Anderson related things on my YouTube channel as well. But you can also listen to us on audio platforms, things like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, things like that. You can rate and review us on those platforms as well. Any little comments and ratings and things like that really do help us to reach a whole new audience, other people who want to speculate on whether big or small heads are better, or whatever Ben was saying about babies earlier. I'm sure that will appeal to someone out there. But yes, it really does help us to reach a new audience. So we're very grateful for any reviews you want to leave us on those platforms. Yeah.
Something else that helps us a lot. Now, obviously, Jack and I are not trying to be billionaires or even possibly even millionaires. But if you want to help us keep this show going, we do it because we're passionate about it and we enjoy it. If you, like us, share a passion, because if you've listened this far, you probably do, and you want to help us out, go to our Patreon, patreon.com/securityhazard. Give what you can, but only what you can. And then we will reward you with lots of really cool videos, one that we just recorded, an audio commentary for Trapped in the Sky, but not Trapped in the Sky as we reviewed on the podcast. A different edition of Trapped in the Sky.
Different edition of Trapped in the Sky. Yes, that's coming out on the Patreon. That's coming out on the Patreon in a few days from now. So look forward to that. That's going to be something different, something very special. Yes, it's funny what you said. Not even millionaires. I would say not even like a tenner, maybe. I'd settle for a tenner, maybe. Tenner would be nice. Tenner would be nice. Anyway, for everything else, go to securityhazard.net. That's where you find blog posts, reviews, all the videos go up there, podcast, everything. It's all on there. It's all happening. Find all the social media links, Facebook, Blue Sky, Twitter, that sort of stuff. It's all on securityhazard.net. Space Precinct reviews have now started every single week on there. So if you want a bit of a space, if you're watching Space Precinct for the first time and you want someone to hold your hand, I will be that person for you.
Someone to commiserate with you.
Enjoy that. Yes. Well, commiserate, celebrate. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yep.
Ben, and, where can people find you on this here internet?
Absolutely everything is on Security Hazard, except for me. I'm on @Supermarionation on Twitter. I'm @BenWolfPage on Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to my channel on YouTube. Please do that. It's @Supermarionation, cinema and marionette put together. I've got some great videos on there about Starfleet and lots of other exciting stuff coming on there.
If you enjoy puppet talk, but like actually well-researched, properly informed puppet talk, head over to Ben's YouTube channel, Supermarionation, because there's lots of really good little video essays and things like that about puppetry and filmmaking on there. It's a great little blend of the two. So
thanks very much.
Go and take a look at that. But that's all for today's show. Thank you all very, very much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, the rustling of paper as I went through all the different pictures. Remember Torchy? There's a lovely picture of Torchy for us to finish.
It's like Torchy ASMR. The rattling of the papers. Oh no, don't. Please, let's never do that again.
But for now, that's where we're finishing. Thank you all very much for tuning in. It's been lovely to have you. And we will catch you next week. Bye for now.